I love that you mentioned the research that you did, and you have done an amazing amount of research, and you had quite the opportunity to put that research to use. Can you tell us about your project in your senior year?
Yeah, I can. We were given an assignment where we have to write a persuasive essay on a topic of our choosing. This was a point where I'm sort of getting into carnivore. And I'm like, okay, well, I could write this essay on some stupid topic like should schools have uniforms, or like just something that's kind of irrelevant, and get an easy A and move on with my life. Or I could take the opportunity to do something that I've wanted to do anyway, which is get a good foundation of my understanding of the carnivore diet and why this would be good for health. Just to really convince myself and to have a good piece of work that I can show other people and other people can use eventually. It's going to be published soon. But yeah, so that was my motivation for doing it. But very quickly I realized, well, the requirement for this essay is 4 or 5 pages, right? But I can't make an argument in that short period of time, in that short amount of space. It simply wouldn't work, because we don't have something as simple as a randomized controlled trial where you randomize one group to a keto diet and one group to carnivore and another group to vegan. It's like that doesn't exist in any sort of way. So I need to take another approach. There needs to be another way for me to establish this. And what I did was I took a less direct route. So I proposed like 9 premises, and if you accepted every single one of them, which I made sure you kind of had to, because I cited so much evidence for each one, you're left with the conclusion that the only diet that's possible to be healthy, like the only potential one that could be good for you, is a carnivore diet. So I can like sort of walk you through it if you want.
I would love that.
Yeah. I started the essay just talking about the deterioration of health over the past 200 years, you could say, and how that's just correlated very, very strongly with a loss of animal fat, a loss of animal protein, and an increase in seed oils and stuff like that. So the correlation from on a larger scale with animal foods and disease is inversely correlated. So that's the first sort of thing that people need to understand. And then I set my thesis, which is basically that you need to eat a carnivore diet because of all these different reasons. And the first one that I start with is ketosis. So I basically talk about how your body can run on fat or it can run on carbohydrate. And when you're in a ketogenic state, you're running on fat. And there's a huge body of evidence for this. I was scouring different studies and just trying to understand what the best evidence to pull would be. And so I grabbed a ton of evidence onto why keto is just simply best relative to a state where you're burning mostly glucose. And that information was easy. Like you have things like babies are born in a state of ketosis. Like that's pretty solid evidence right there. We are literally born in ketosis. And then there's all these things about how it's preventative in type 2 diabetes, and they're comparing low fat diets and high fat diets and seeing how that affects various biomarkers and antioxidant defense and ketone bodies and what they do, and anti-inflammatory measures. And just I cited a ton of sources, explained them, and just sort of established it that, well, being in a state where you're burning fat is best. And the next thing that I talked about was carbohydrates. So I talked about why carbohydrates are unhealthy. And this was relatively simple. We have no requirement for them. That's number one. We don't need a single carbohydrate ever. Just the effect of, glucose, how cancer cells thrive on it via the Warburg effect, how carbohydrates lead to AGEs, advanced glycation end products. I really went into establishing why glucose is bad. And then, of course, with the fruit craze, I then did a separate section devoted to fructose and how it's actually even more inflammatory, even more has an even more glycative effect than glucose, causes more production of triglycerides. And you're basically just a ton of evidence how it causes fatty liver. And then I talked about the biological or like evolutionary, you could say, foundation for why that would exist, and that eating a bunch of fruit gets us fat so we can survive the winter, and we can have body fat when there's less animals around, which makes perfect sense. So fruit just has that fat, has that like fat putting on effect, you could say. And so those were the first couple things. Then I talked about vegetables and how they're the parts of the plant that clearly don't want to be eaten. So they're the roots, the stems, the leaves, the tubers, the roots, all that stuff. And these are the parts of the plant that essentially foster the growth of the fruit, which wants to be eaten so it can spread its seeds. And as a result, there's all these defense mechanisms within them. So you have phytates, lectins, saponins, glyphosate, glycoalkaloids, tannins, oxalates, like phytoestrogens. There's a million things, so many compounds in there that are toxic, extremely toxic, and they're well studied as well. And I had a lot of evidence as to why these things are toxic. And so I basically just made the point that ingesting plants is microdosing, if not macrodosing poison. I mean, in many cases, you are macrodosing poison. A very small amount of plants are edible. So that was sort of
Yeah.
the next thing. That was the next thing that I talked about. I talked a little bit
That's
about
I do want
yeah,
to just say real quick, it's interesting how most of us group fruits, we say fruits and vegetables. Like they're the same thing. And it's like, okay, you've got the fruits, they might have a fattening effect. You've got the vegetables, well, those have a toxic effect. They don't want to be eaten at all. And so you're right, like we lump all of those together. I'm really glad that you kind of separated them out and talked about those two things as really what they are. They're two complete, distinct, different things.
right. Absolutely. They're so distinguishable. These are not the same things whatsoever. The fact that the guidelines put fruits and vegetables into the same category is just absurd. It's crazy, insane. So, and then I talked about how I talked about like more little nuanced things that weren't actually in the main 9 points, but things like antioxidants and how there's actually no benefit to eating exogenous antioxidants, like none whatsoever, because we have the endogenous ones that are upregulated in acetic ketosis. So again, it makes really, really zero sense. And then there are even studies showing that a 10-week period without dietary fruits and vegetables was a decrease in oxidative damage to DNA, blood proteins, and plasma lipids, which is just, these studies are literally there, like they exist, and people just want to neglect them and look at epidemiology showing that the more fruits and vegetables you eat, the healthier you are. Well, obviously that's the result you're going to find when those people are also drinking less alcohol, smoking less, more exercise, more sunlight, probably better off socioeconomically, quite possibly. So again, it's just, really poor arguments. And
It's
then
bad news. It's bad news for people around here in Salt Lake City. We're like the multi-level marketing capital of the world, and there's
yeah,
whole companies based on like selling Jamoni juice from whatever Amazon forest, like for the antioxidants. Like please, like you're just getting into somebody's downline. You're not going to get any health benefit from this. I'm sorry.
I know, exactly right. Absolutely no benefits to things like that. Yeah, the next point I made was simply that meat has everything that we need. So every single nutrient is in found optimal ratios. But in this section particularly, I talked about the things that aren't in plants. So the things that are only in meat, and the ones specifically that I discussed were vitamin D3, vitamin B12, creatine, carnitine, carnosine, heme iron, DHA, taurine, vitamin B3, B2, retinol, selenium, B5, B6, and zinc. Plants really don't have these things, along with a lot of others, a lot of enzymes and stuff that's only in animal foods. So I talked about all that, just to sort of further cement this idea that no, plant-based diets don't work. So at this point, we've kind of established, well, carbs are bad, keto is good, vegetables bad, fruits bad, meat good. Meat has everything that we need. So we're kind of getting there a little bit, but we're not quite there. Still have some more stuff to establish. Then talked about saturated fat, devoted a section to that. Talked about Ansel Keys and the past with that sort of thing, and how there's actually research in the past 5 years that's indicating saturated fat is not correlated with disease at all. Meat is correlated with longevity in a recent 2020 study, and there's no cancer risk for meat. The cancer risk is actually more so associated with fiber and certain plant foods. So, again, like this stuff wasn't just panning out as people thought it would. LDL, no risk in heart disease. It's actually LDL is inversely associated with a lot of atherosclerotic events, and it's inversely associated with psychiatric issues. So higher LDL means less psychiatric issues. Also, 54% of breast milk is saturated fat. Like, how could it be killing us if it's so ubiquitous in breast milk? Like, what is it? How is this even real? How is this possible? Just
Totally.
crazy ideas, right?